In the summer of 1914, Vienna was still one of the most elegant cities in the world. Its coffeehouses were full, its theaters were performing, its currency, the Austro-Hungarian krone, had held its value for decades, backed by something real, something limited, something that couldn't simply be printed on demand. Then came the announcement: war. Within weeks, governments across Europe made a decision that few ordinary citizens noticed at the time. One by one, they suspended the gold standard. They quietly removed the constraint that had kept their currencies tied to physical reserves. And in doing so, they unlocked something they had always wanted but never had formal permission to use: the ability to create money from nothing. Most people assumed this was a temporary wartime measure, a practical solution to an extraordinary situation. They believed that once the war ended, the old rules would return. They didn't fully understand what had been released, and that raises a question most people never think to ask. Why does paper money almost always start dying before the war even reaches its most destructive phase? Why does the currency collapse seem to begin not after the crisis, but right at its edge? Is it coincidence? Is it panic? Or is there something built into the very structure of paper money that makes this outcome nearly inevitable every single time? What follows is a pattern that has repeated across centuries, across continents, across very different political systems. And once you see it clearly, the modern financial world starts to look quite different. This video examines the hidden mechanism behind why paper currencies consistently fail at the edge of major crises and wars, not as a political argument and not as a prediction, but as a documented historical observation drawn from some of the most consequential financial collapses in recorded history. The goal is understanding the pattern and understanding why it keeps appearing. To analyze this properly, it helps to think about what paper money actually is at its foundation, not what governments say it is, not what economics textbooks describe, but what it functionally represents in terms of trust, obligation, and the relationship between a state and its citizens. Hard money, gold, silver, copper, carries its value in itself. You cannot conjure it. You must mine it, refine it, transport it. Its supply grows slowly. This creates a real constraint on government spending. If a government wants to fund a military campaign using gold, it must collect that gold first, through taxation, through borrowing, through conquest. Every coin spent is a coin that had to come from somewhere real. Paper money changes that equation completely. Paper is a promise, a note that says, "Trust us, this represents value." And as long as people believe the promise, the system functions. The critical detail, the one that matters enormously when tension rises, is that the promise can be extended infinitely. New notes can be created at almost no cost. New obligations can be issued in seconds. The constraint that existed with hard money simply disappears, and this is precisely where the pattern begins. Consider what happened in colonial America in 1775. The Continental Congress faced an immediate and overwhelming problem. It needed to fund a revolution against the most powerful military force in the world. It had almost no gold. It had no established system of taxation. It had no credit on international markets. What it did have was a printing press and the authority to issue paper notes, what would become known as the Continental Dollar. In the first year, the currency functioned. Soldiers were paid. Supplies were purchased. The revolution moved forward. But the Congress kept printing. By 1777, inflation was severe. By 1779, prices had risen so dramatically that George Washington described the situation as catastrophic for morale and supply chains. By 1781, the Continental Dollar had lost nearly all its value. A phrase entered the American language that survives to this day: not worth a continental. What happened here was not a failure of management or bad luck. It was the logical endpoint of using an expandable currency to fund an open-ended military conflict. The paper died because the promise behind it was destroyed by overextension. Move forward to 1861 and a conflict of even larger scale. The American Civil War required financing of a kind neither the Union nor the Confederacy had anticipated. The Union, under Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, introduced the greenback paper notes not backed by gold, issued to fund the war. Between 1862 and 1865, the Union printed over $450 million in greenbacks. Inflation rose. The currency depreciated against gold, sometimes sharply. Gold became the shadow currency that tracked the real cost of things while paper tracked the official fiction. The Confederacy had it far worse, with no industrial base, no international credit, and no significant gold reserves. Confederate currency began inflating within months of the war's start. By 1864, prices in Richmond had risen by over 9,000% from their 1861 levels. The Confederate dollar did not simply decline, it dissolved, and with it, so did much of the South's capacity to maintain organized resistance. Both sides were using paper. Both sides experienced the same corrosion. The difference was only in how long it took, but perhaps no story illustrates the mechanism more precisely than Germany between 1921 and 1923. The First World War had already exhausted the German economy. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed reparations that the Weimar Republic could not pay through normal taxation without political collapse. The solution, or what felt like a solution, was to print, to create papier-mâché in quantities the world had never seen. By November 1923, the exchange rate had reached 4.2 trillion marks to $1 American. Workers were being paid twice daily because waiting until evening meant the morning's wages had already lost most of their value. A wheelbarrow of currency could not buy a loaf of bread. The important detail here is the timing. The hyperinflation did not arrive after a new crisis. It arrived as the consequence of how the previous crisis had been financed. The paper had absorbed the accumulated pressure of the war, the reparations, the political instability, and then it gave way. The collapse was the delayed accounting. The paper died because all the hidden costs it had been absorbing eventually had to surface somewhere. By now, a pattern begins to take shape, and it is not simply that governments spend too much. The mechanism is more precise than that. Paper money gives governments a tool that hard money does not: the ability to tax citizens without their explicit consent. When a government prints new currency to fund spending, the existing money in circulation loses purchasing power. Everyone holding that currency becomes slightly poorer. It is taxation without a vote, without a bill, without a visible line item. Economists call it seigniorage. In practice, it functions as an invisible levy spread across every wallet, every savings account, every pension held in that currency. In peacetime, this process tends to be gradual and tolerable. People adapt. The erosion is real but manageable. In crisis, in war, in collapse, in existential pressure, governments accelerate the process dramatically. They have to. The spending requirements of a major war are beyond what any population would voluntarily accept through direct taxation. The political costs would be too high. The paper currency becomes the mechanism through which those costs are distributed, invisibly and immediately, and citizens at some level feel it, not always consciously, but through rising prices, through the instinctive movement toward hard assets, toward foreign currencies, toward gold, toward land. The collective behavior reveals an awareness that the promise is being diluted, that the paper is absorbing more than it can hold. This is why the currency often begins dying before the worst of the crisis arrives, because those closest to the information, merchants, bankers, government insiders, experienced traders, begin repositioning before the general public understands what is happening. The paper starts losing trust among the most informed first, and that erosion moves outward in concentric rings until it becomes undeniable. What this tells us about paper money is not that it is inherently dishonest or that all paper systems are fraudulent. Many paper systems have functioned with reasonable stability across long stretches of history. The insight is more specific. Paper currencies carry a structural vulnerability that only fully reveals itself under extreme fiscal pressure. They give the institutions that control them an exit from the constraints that hard money imposes. And history shows with striking consistency that under sufficient pressure, that exit will be used. The pattern is not conspiracy. It is architecture. The system was built with a door, and when the pressure becomes high enough, the door opens. So what does a thoughtful person do with this understanding? Perhaps not to panic, not to abandon participation in the modern financial system, but perhaps to hold the history clearly in view, to notice when the mechanisms that preceded past collapses begin operating again, to understand that stable and permanent are not the same thing, and that the difference between the two is often most visible only in retrospect. Most people move through economic history the way most people move through most things, without looking closely at the structure beneath the surface. A smaller group finds it worth their time to understand why things behave the way they do, why patterns recur, why the same pressures tend to produce the same outcomes across very different centuries and very different regimes. Which of these historical cases surprised you most? Is there a part of this pattern you think has an important exception? Leave it in the comments. The discussion on topics like this tends to be worth reading. The pattern is still unfolding, and we'll keep examining it here. Till next time. Stay safe. Farewell.